so this is the second of our series of sailing lectures. After Robert and Michelle, so we have Bill and Caroline, and take it away, I guess.
Okay, thank you for that long and formal introduction.
Yep.
Our title, Deepwater and Shoal, is Plagiarism. As some of you will know, there's a classic sailing book written in about 1930 with this title, and we've stolen the title. Okay.
Oh, Deepwater.
So let's get started. This is a sort of story. So in the beginning, that's us, by the way, more than 50 years ago. And when we started sailing, we really were too young to know any better. Therefore, we did things which nowadays I would not recommend. One of them was going offshore sailing in a 22-foot boat that my father bought in 1969. Nice little boat, but if you've ever sailed in the open sea in 22-foot boats, you know they're incredibly uncomfortable, they're incredibly wet, and in Britain they're incredibly cold. But we didn't know any better, so we went sailing. And in 2 years, we sailed up and down the English Channel, went to the Netherlands, Belgium, France, of course. We even did a trip to Ireland. Sometimes with my father, sometimes just the two of us. Now, in 1971, our whole world changed forever. Our daughter was born, and the Jacqueline, which was my father's boat, was too small for us. So we did the obvious thing, we bought a bigger boat. We couldn't afford it, but anyhow we bought it. This is a French boat called an arpège, which I'm sure you know. They were sort of basically the boat that put the French boat building on the map as really. This picture was taken actually in British waters near Toulangay. 30 foot long, a real proper sailing boat, really nice boat. Even had an engine and was well equipped. Oh, heads with a door. I mean, this was a real step up. We sailed this boat over much of the same area, but particularly in the southern North Sea, and our typical vacation consisted of dashing across the North Sea to the Dutch coast, cruising the Dutch coast. I should have mentioned that the passage from where we kept the boat to IJmuiden near Amsterdam is about 150 miles. So these are decent sized passages, but not huge. It wasn't all offshore sailing, it wasn't all passage making. Some years ago, a friend of ours found this picture in a cruising guide and sent us a photocopy. That's after we painted cadenza black. By the way, I would strongly recommend don't paint a boat black. It causes all sorts of problems. Every scratch, and that sort of stuff. Anyway, the caption says, near high water, a yacht drawing 5 feet or more can reach row edge and stay long enough for a drink at the pub. And sure enough, if you look at the table in the pub, there are 2 kids there who I'm pretty certain are our children, Kate and Martin. The rise of tide here is 15 feet, so low water.
Mary?
This is really solid mud. I mean, you really have to work the tides. Anyway, we had tremendous fun with cadenza. We probably still own her, but in 1978 we came to the US. We sold cadenza. I recently discovered she's still in commission. She's racing in the Irish Sea, based in the Isle of Man. But for 10 years or so, we sailed lasers. Some of you may recognize this place. This is Harrod Lake Camp in Maine, and where we were cruising with the lasers. We also raced the lasers. For those of you who are interested in these things, I can tell you that in any breeze, with my weight, I'm faster than Caroline in the laser. In light weather, I'll let you, Caroline, tell you the situation. It's good because we don't actually compete with each other. It all depends on the weather. Anyway, that was great. And then one fateful day in 1992, I picked up a yachting magazine which had an article on the second-hand boat market. here it had this picture of this Hinckley, 40-foot Hinckley.
Bermuda 40. Bermuda 40.
Yeah.
It's actually not, it's a Hinckley competition 41, but
Oh.
it's,
Sorry, look, so it's
yeah,
like-
but it's very much the same. Anyway, the captain said you could lose your heart to a boat like this, and I mean, and it's dead right. So I went home and I said to Caroline, look, we could afford that boat. And Caroline, for some reason, didn't kick me out the door, and we started looking. A few months later, our son Martin saw a tiny advertisement in the New York Times. It said, classic 41-foot sloop, one owner, fresh water, line Great Lakes, fabulous condition, $95,000, attention Bill Brawl. We were living in Pittsburgh at the time, so we drove up to Lake Erie, and this is what we saw. We bought her on the spot, we still have her, and we're still in contact with Bill McGraw, who's been a really good, supportive and friendly person. A little bit about the boat. We call her Quicksilver. She's a Swan 41. She's almost 20 years old when we bought her, built in 1973 or 1974. Do you know Rumline, the Tartan 41 on Sea Dock? Same designer, same length, same year, and pretty similar boat. So you get an idea of what boats looked like in those days. Pretty long overhangs.
Sorry, can I open it or no, will you?
Up to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's more chairs.
Yeah. Maybe leave it open.
There's a chair in here.
There's a chair. There's a.
Everybody move one.
Yep.
No, not you, you have to move back.
Oh.
Too big.
I'll switch with you.
Yep.
How's that? Is that okay?
I actually think, George, that it's getting pretty hot in here, that leaving the door ajar is probably a good thing.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised because this room is usually a meat locker.
Yeah. So what is there to say? This picture shows Quicksilver doing what she does best, which is go to windward. That's Caroline at the helm. Caroline always stands to helm. I like to sit down. Notice the big Genoa and the very short boom, high aspect ratio mainsail. What else is there to say? Nowadays you have racing boats and you have cruising boats. In the early 1970s were just about the end of when people had dual purpose boats. So these Swans were racing boats and very successful racing boats. Swans from the 1970s have won the Bermuda race 3 times and the Whitbread Round the World race. The previous owner, that's Bill McGraw's father, raced seriously. If you look at the logo on the spinnaker, you know everything you need to know about his attitude towards racing and in fact towards life in general. Really nice family. We have never raced. But the other thing was about these boats was they were meant to be offshore cruising boats. And this was an interesting period because fiberglass was just taking over from wooden boats. And 2 companies, Hinckley in Maine, which was that earlier photograph, and Swan in Finland, were the first companies who built sort of top of the line elegant boats in fiberglass. If we look here, you can see that this is a recent photograph. You can see the offshore boat, lots of handholds, berths arranged for offshore sailing. In the forepeak, where nowadays you'd have a double bunk, there were, when we bought the boat, 6 spinnakers and goodness knows how many other sails. What would you do with 6 spinnakers, you might ask? But anyway, we've sailed pretty well the entire east coast of the United States. We've been based in Annapolis on the Chesapeake Bay. My sister Cara lived in Savannah for a while. We cruised the Outer Banks several times. We took a trip to Bermuda. Mainly sailing by ourselves, but sometimes with friends or family. Richard Feeney, whose father is here, Paul. Hello, Paul. Who is our nephew. Took it all the way down to the tip of Florida, and we also sailed in the Bahamas on that trip. There's Richard. This is fairly typical pose. Those of you who know Richard would not be at all surprised. He was sort of born and bred at the Ithaca Yacht Club. On the side he went with high school and a few things like that, but he's been a sailor all his life, and a very good one. We've also gone north. Mainly we've gone north, and this shows the cruising ground from the Chesapeake Bay up the New Jersey coast through New England to Maine. We've gone to Nova Scotia once, and we took across the Atlantic via the Azores for 7 years some time back. So anyway, that's the sort of summary of the deep water sailing we've done on this boat. I'm going to now hand over to Caroline, and she's going to tell you a bit about the shoal water, and particularly she's going to tell you why we so much enjoy sailing in the Chesapeake.
So, Quicksilver is now in a marina in Galesville on the West River, which is just about 12 or 15 miles south of Annapolis. It has been based in several other places in and near Annapolis, including a very pleasant few years at a friend's dock. If you transit the 200 miles of the Chesapeake Bay, you will note the many lighthouses as you go. I'm not going to show you all of them, just a couple that are sort of absolutely unmistakable that we see every time, or almost every time we come out into the bay. This is Thomas Point Light. It's between Annapolis and the West River. It's the last lighthouse of this once popular style left functioning in its original location. Now it's fully automated and maintained by some tourist foundation that takes trips out there. There's no longer a lighthouse keeper on. This is another unmistakable lighthouse. This is near the Choptank River, which is one of our standard sort of day sails from Galesville. It marks a former island that was 700 acres in 1675. The island had vanished by the late 1940s after sinking steadily since the last ice age, along with all the land around Chesapeake Bay. So basically it's the land that's east of the Appalachians. And oh, I didn't say, the Chesapeake is mainly fed by the Susquehanna, which is quite close to us, just a relatively few miles south the watershed changes. In Annapolis, you can't get away from the Naval Academy. I mean, you can't miss it. On the water, you see some different things. They have a one design fleet of 44 footers. This is, in fact, the third one design fleet they've had, and they now have a fourth. But this was, but it's very fine to have these spinnakers come towards you. They also have a fleet of patrol boats used for training. They're called YPs. I don't know why. And you can see them on the Chesapeake or near the Atlantic coast when they're training. Sort of typically every midshipman has to do one summer on the YPs. Near Norfolk, Virginia, you may see a submarine. They don't come up to Annapolis. Of course, you see the Coast Guard too. This is the US Coast Guard replacing a buoy in a river. I will say buoy sometimes, and maybe I can sometimes remember to say buoy, but so you see much larger Coast Guard vessels out in the bay. This silhouette is unmistakable for anyone who's been on the water in the Chesapeake. This is a car transporter. Most of the car transporters are taking Toyotas to Baltimore. This actually isn't. It's her title is Liberty Passion, and she's a military vessel and has accommodation for people as well as vehicles, presumably tanks. And she's supposed to be ready to take them anywhere in the world that the US wants to have tanks or whatever deployed.
Which is the front.
Which is up front.
The front is on the left.
The pointy end.
Because it looks like the bridge on the right.
We see lots of tugs and container ships. Most of the tugs in the Chesapeake are pushing their barges. This one, I looked her up, and she carries liquid cargo, probably fuel often. And turning to fishing, there's a processing plant for menhaden at Reedville on the western shore in Virginia. And a fleet of large boats like this go out for a day and bring their catch to the plant. Menhaden is a small, oily fish. It's used for bait, but the most valuable product from it is its oil, fish oil, omega-3. Think about that. And they use seine nets. The fish float very near the surface, and they use seine nets to round them up. Everyone knows that Maryland has crabs. The traditional way to fish for crabs out in the bay or in rivers where it's permitted is to lay pots with bait. This waterman has lifted his pots and is heading home up the Sassafras. This was given the forecast for Tropical Storm Isaias to pass 2 years ago. We were heading up the Sassafras for exactly the same reason, to get shelter for the storm that was coming the next day. Hauling pots or nets is usually a two-person task, but some watermen can work by themselves, operating truck liners to fish for crabs in sheltered waters. A baited line is stretched between two small anchored buoys, and the line is hooked to run over a roller at the side of the boat. I'm not quite there, almost at the side of the boat. And crabs grab onto the bait. Sometimes the bait is chicken necks, which can be secured very well to the line. The waterman has a net ready to catch any crabs which keep holding onto the bait. This waterman would probably have to throw this one back when he got to the second stage, because there are rigid rules on measuring your crabs, and that looks a pretty small crab to me. In some places, you will see crab houses over the water. They have tanks for keeping crabs until they molt their shells and become soft crabs, which you might be used to seeing in restaurants. This is in the passage through Tangier Island. This island is remarkably isolated, given that it's really so close to the nation's capital. It's 12 miles from the eastern shore and 15 miles across the bay by ferry to Reedville on the western shore. But neither of those places where the ferries go are very easy to get to, so they're very isolated. While we're in Tangier, here's a sunset view. I have hundreds of sunsets and sunrises, but one was enough. A local method for catching fish is the pound net. It's positioned with a net fence that runs to a vertical net fence that runs to shore and forces any fish that swim into it into a pound. Most of them are not in a river like this, but on the shore of the main bay, and you have to take note of them as you're sailing. I'm not sure how many fish these herons, plus one osprey, will leave for the fishermen. Now to some older forms of fishing. Skipjacks have traditionally been used to dredge for oysters under sail in winter months. In 2017, there were apparently 15 working skipjacks left. At its stern, you can see it has a little boat on davits. That's called a yawl boat. But skipjacks are sailing boats. They don't have engines, and a yawl boat, seen more clearly here, provides propulsion to get to the fishing grounds. Many skipjacks are now in maritime museums or used for trips and charters. But at least in 2017, there was still some fishing in the winter. Oysters were almost wiped out by overfishing. Now active efforts are underway to repopulate the bay with oysters. They lay reefs with old shells, and then they bring oyster spat to start tiny little oysters to start a colony. This is probably oyster shells, I think. This is a buy boat, built for buying catch directly from watermen and selling on to markets or seafood packing houses. Now they're mainly private yachts or used to carry tourists on short trips. But there are a lot of them. They clearly were worth preserving and getting into usable condition. One of our favorite places to visit is the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum in St. Michael's. That's on the eastern shore. It's another easy day sails for us. It has a wide array of traditional boats to view, including a growing collection of vessels the museum has restored in its very active boat restoration program. The Edna Lockwood is another form of oyster dredger from the Bugeye, etymology unknown. She was given a new hull in a project that ran from early 2016 to late 2018. The logs being shaped here to form the new hull are from tree trunks that were seasoned in the water for a year beside the museum before construction began. Here's a picture of her. The superstructure was still capable of restoration rather than replacement, and was fitted to the hull, and then she was re-rigged. Compared to a skipjack, a Bugeye has two masts, a flatter bottom, and a centerboard. She is now used as a floating classroom. The season is longer than here, and many years we've enjoyed fall duck cruises in company or in the same chartered boat with Claire Futram, and sailing friends from earlier periods in her life. It can be cold, but we bundle up. The migrating ducks and fall colours can be great. And thanks to Claire for this photo of Quicksilver under sail. in the Chesapeake. We don't have many of those, though. We do have one from Robert and Michelle. Pelicans. It's special to see pelicans in the Chesapeake, but you can quite often see them in the lower Chesapeake Bay. But to see them close up, you need to go south. This was in Oakland, but I have some other bird pictures, and it seemed worth covering pelicans. Ospreys favor navigation marks for nesting. This is a lit mark that has been modified so the light remains visible while the ospreys are building their nests and breeding. But they don't need a platform. They're fantastic nest builders, and you find places where almost every navigation mark has an osprey nest.
Oh.
But boat owners should beware. Ospreys may build a nest on your boat. This guy decided it wasn't worth trying to get his boat into commission early enough in the season, and ended up basically donating it to the ospreys and funding some local people to make sure that mooring kept secure. So this is used mostly. Okay, now I think we're
Yep.
off the bill.
Back to deep water. We have taken the trip up to Maine 6 or 8 times for the round trip. This is the route we normally take. Robert and Michelle explained that in order to get from the Chesapeake going north or in the other direction, the best route is actually to come down the Delaware Bay. They were able to cut through Cape May. Cape May is there. There's a canal through there with a bridge, and Robert told the story of squeezing under that bridge. We can't get under, we have to go around the outside, which costs us 20 or 30 miles. Then, let me just point out some of the places. This is Block Island in Rhode Island. This is Cutty Hunk. Woods Hole is here. This is Provincetown. This is Gloucester, Massachusetts. Maine begins in Gloucester, despite being in Massachusetts. There's the Isle of Shoals, and this is the Maine border. We have a friend who for 20 years did the trip between Woods Hole and the Chesapeake, so he did it 40 times, and this is one of his quotations. Many of our best sails and many of our worst sails have been in the Delaware Bay. We usually spend a night on the Cohansey River, and this is the Shipjohn Lighthouse just off there. So our passages typically start here. The reason that the Delaware is challenging, or one of the reasons, are the tides. This picture is actually Woods Hole, when it's about a 4-knot tide. What's the tide in the Delaware? 1.5, 2 knots. There's quite a strong tide. You don't want to go against it. So you get up, set your alarm when the tide serves. Last time we came up, we set the alarm at 12:30 in the middle of the night. But we're rewarded by us averaging 8 knots over 60 miles, so you get it both ways. Some of you may have heard the book, Gentlemen Never Sail to Weather, and Never Go to Windward. Don't believe it. It's a complete and utter lie. And if you do coastal passages, you spend a lot of time sailing to windward. The Delaware, the prevailing wind is southerly, so you're likely to beat down it. This shows typical conditions. Notice the coffee cups, the bag with the binoculars, and the sunscreen. That's the blue thing. By the way, the colours in this is wrong. My face is not as red as that. Okay, anyway, let's move on. What you hope is that once you get round Cape May, the southerly wind becomes your friend, and this is what you're hoping for. Now here we are, beam reaching, I don't know, 12, 15 knots of wind, running off 6.5, 7 knots without any effort. In this picture, notice the lines around the mast. We have all the halyards and the reefing gear are gathered at the mast. Nowadays, it's normal to run halyards and reefing lines and things like that to the cockpit. We've sailed on boats with both arrangements. I'm not sure which I prefer. You can also see that we have lines ready to tie in 3 reefs in case of trouble. Okay, life at sea. Life at sea basically comes down to 2 things: eating and sleeping. That's basically, I mean, there's navigating and sailing the boat and those sorts of things, but living at sea, living at a heel. You've got to imagine cooking, doing the dishes, all those sorts of things, when the boat is bouncing around in waves. So here you can see the high so-called fiddles, the edges to the working surfaces so things don't fall off. The cooker is on gimbals. There's a strap down there. Could you point at the strap, Caroline? That's a strap which reaches out so the helmsman, or the cook, can secure himself, or more often herself, and stay as going. You can just see into the aft cabin, and that's the corner of Caroline's bunk there. Okay, sleeping. When there's 2 people on the boat, it's 4 hours on, 4 hours off. Here's Richard again, in a saloon berth with the lee cloths, which are really vital because they hold you and so you don't fall out when you're bouncing around. The key thing on this is if you have doubt, call me. If one of us is going to sleep, I apologise for that. The Ithaca Yacht Club just sent me a message to say I've got a reservation for dinner. If you're going to sleep soundly, you've got to be confident that the person on deck is under control and is going to call you if they want something. The most likely reason to be called, surprisingly enough, is shipping. And here is a tug. Caroline showed a tug pushing. Once they get out to sea, they go on the wire, and the barge they're towing can be a long way behind the tug. You don't want to go between them. And at night, the tug is covered with gaudy lights, and the barge may be very badly lit. There's also, with tugs, big ships. This says Chipotle on the side, and those containers are banana containers.
Chiquita.
I'm sorry, Chiquita.
Yeah, we can't read.
It's Chiquita. They're bananas anyhow.
Yeah.
So with ships running into Philadelphia and New York and tugs and fishing boats, there are times when having 2 sets of eyes on deck is worth calling the other person. Okay, when you talk about sailing offshore, people always say, what about bad weather? Well, bad weather, strong winds start at about 20 or 30 knots. In this picture, I think it's maybe 25 knots of wind. Jeremy is looking very happy. The reason he's looking happy is because he's going downwind. He's wearing a safety harness. We always wear safety harnesses in bad weather. He isn't clipped in. But if he was going to windward, he wouldn't look so happy. Going into big waves is not fun. Can be very unpleasant. We both used to suffer from seasickness, which is absolutely miserable. It's one of the few things that get better with age, is seasickness. And the modern pills and patches are really good. Of course, once the wind gets over about 30 knots, you're moving out of the strong wind world into the gales. Here's another picture of Jeremy, actually, 30 years earlier. And this is cadenza under storm sails. I think it was blowing about 30 knots when this picture was taken, but we were in shelter, so the waves are quite small. The official definition of a gale is 34 knots or above, sustained wind. We're not talking about squalls here. Sometimes somebody will say they were out in 40 knots, which means that it blew 40 knots for 5 minutes. The thing about gales is when after they've been blowing for several hours, the winds build up. I think the biggest waves we've seen are about 15 feet, fortunately going downwind. We've been offshoring 3 gales in all our years. Once we were trying to get to windward, so we hove to. Twice we were going downwind, and we managed to keep going. The good news is twofold. First is the boat can take it, and the other is that the gales are rare. They're usually well forecast. On the other hand, we do our utmost to avoid them. They're not fun, but it's something to put up with. Okay, this is another of Caroline's pictures. This one's dawn, and this is of course what you're hoping for. Here we are, going along on a close reach, maybe doing 4 knots, 4.5 knots, calm sea, balmy night. It's Caroline's picture, so she was on watch. I was probably down below sleeping, or perhaps I was shaving or making coffee. At 8 o'clock, we change watch, and mark a position on the chart, and away we go. Actually, strong winds are very rare on that stretch of coast in the summer. This is much more common. Motoring under autopilot in a flat car. I wanted to show this picture because it shows how the cockpit is laid out. It's a traditional cockpit with the helmsman basically is the helm. Have the wheel, autopilot and engine control. Everything else is in the forward part of the cockpit. So the person who is not at the helm is managing the main sheet and traffic. I think, pointed at Caroline, it's pretty obvious we say our traffic and the main sheet. The jib sheets are these big witches. The black witch just at the back there is the furling line for the row of furling. And so the sailing part of the boat is done by the person in the cockpit. Notice that the instruments are the forward part of the cockpit. It's quite common on modern boats to have the instruments where only the helmsman can see them, which I think is really bad. With this arrangement, the person who's not at the helm is navigating, and in fog, it's the person who's not at the helm who is looking at the radar. Okay. 2 days after leaving Ship John, with any luck, you're in Block Island, and here we are. Here, this was photographed from the town moorings on Block Island, and the long passages behind. These reds, Caroline, really, we're going to have to report the projector for these reds. Anyway, now the next stage is back to Caroline, and she's going to talk about going from Block Island to Maine and some of the things we see in Maine.
So, as we're on our way to Maine, we look out for wildlife as well as shipping, hoping to see dolphins, porpoises, even whales, as well as the pelagic birds that spend most of their life at sea. Photography and identification is easier if you see dolphins or porpoises when at anchor. These are dolphins in Cape May, New Jersey, but we quite often see them out in the water. My camera is not a very good camera, it has too much shutter lag for catching dolphins. You miss them all the time. Whales, the most likely place to see whales is between Provincetown and the Isles of Shoal, so basically off Massachusetts. This day we were lucky. At top is a humpback, and below from the fin, I can tell it's a fin whale or a minke. The difference would be to the size. Minkies are quite common and smaller, but the buzz was that there was a fin whale close in shore at that time. It all depends where the fish are. The whales come where the fish are. Bill left us in Block Island, so first stop from there would often be Cuttyham. It's the westernmost of the Elizabeth Islands on the south shore of Buzzards Bay, and the Elizabeth Islands point towards Woods Hole and Cape Cod. It has an inner pool crowded with moorings, but we usually pick up a mooring or anchor in the outer bay. We were taking advantage of a sunny afternoon to do a little bit of laundry. You can date this. Those are homemade cloth masks. So this was the summer of 2020, before everybody had better masks. It's a popular weekend sail from Newport and other places across Buzzards Bay, and the raw bar boat often does good trade, so he's up against a motorboat now offering clams and oysters. Another place we usually stop is in Gloucester. You want to time the next hop for the strong tides round Cape Ann, which is just north of Gloucester. If we're lucky, there's a spot to anchor for free in the public federal anchorage by the Coast Guard station. There's just a little triangle there, which is federal property, and anybody can anchor, but of course it's first come, first served. Near us are 2 Grand Bank schooners. Now they take tourists round Gloucester Harbour. Once they would have taken long fishing expeditions to the Grand Banks. Serious fishing still goes on from this well-protected harbour. This is a long liner coming in soon after sunrise, and the reds are a bit extreme there too. Some of you may remember that about 30 years ago, there was a long liner, the Andrea Gale, lost with her 6 crew in a storm that was called the Perfect Storm. So this is the harbour that they went out from. There was the 30-year anniversary added to the website, and the people, the family members who remember the sort of 30-year-old who died, were very happy with the book, The Perfect Storm, and not so happy with the movie, which invented relationships that went to now we're in Maine. We just have to hop past things. Now I wondered if Steve and Elena Flash would be here. Lighthouses are important on any coast, and I just picked one, and this is on the way into Booth Bay Harbour, where Steve and Elena spend a lot of time and have their boat. One of our favourite places is Matinicus Island. This is 20 miles offshore and not visited by many tourists. It's an active lobstering harbour, but there are some moorings for visitors. You might be able to see where Bill was pointing. The pickup one for a visitor's mooring has a plastic bottle. Inside the plastic bottle is a map of the island and instructions to pay by leaving cash in the bottle when you leave. The guy who puts them down and maintains them is a lobsterman, and he's out at the moment hauling his pots probably. Tides here are 9 to 12 foot, and when you bring your dinghy ashore, you may need to climb a ladder up the ferry pier. There isn't any good shore to come into in the harbour. Matinicus has no grocery store, at least it didn't in our recent visits. Our first visit did have one, but it does have a bakery. You can see there's a sign posted, or the main sign says it's open at 8 a.m. most summer days. But today, it says closed Sunday, August 11th. Thank you for your patience. This means that Eva the baker and her husband must both be off the island for some reason, because usually one of them is there to sell you bread. On the sign, Eva the baker gives her phone number but warns your cell phone may not work here. Your cell phone may not work in almost anywhere in the island. The only place is at a high point on the island. Eva, who had taught in the island's one-room elementary school before she married the island's telecommunications engineer, is an author as well as a baker. Her book, Well Out to Sea, is delightful, conveying the challenges of being somewhere so remote, and also describing how the lobstermen and the other year-round residents look out for each other in times when things are difficult. A few years ago, the community, led by Eva, built a small library and positioned it where it could provide Wi-Fi service. So now you can go up and sit outside the library and get Wi-Fi if you visit the island. Bill is there for a sense of scale. It is a small library. The islanders have long encouraged reuse. So if you happen to need any mooring lines, you could go drop in and pick up some lines that the lobstermen have discarded. And occasionally they've organized work parties to get old vehicles off the island. That's a series of projects and involves chartering a vessel onto which the old vehicles can go. Maine has fog, you've heard about that. Plans must be flexible. This sailing school at Round Pond had the boats keep close to the harbour entrance until the fog lifted. It really was quite thick. Okay. Have you ever seen a fog bow? This was one morning in Castine, and it's probably the best one that I've ever seen there. Lovely. Eastern Maine has dozens of islands and anchorages, and picking a few to show is tough. This is Friendship, a lobstering harbour. This is Frenchboro on Long Island, so called because it was formerly owned by Mr. Long. It's south of Swans Island, and we're looking north towards Mount Desert Island. I'm not saying anything about the two terrific harbours on Mount Desert Island, which is where Acadia National Park is. Northeast Harbour and Southwest Harbour are terrific, particularly if you need supplies or want to do some tourist things on the island. We did meet somebody on Long Island who knew where Ithaca was, and knew about Ithaca because of Gimme Coffee. This view of Mount Desert Island is from Quicksilver at anchor in a small bay north of Swans Island. It looks like open water, but in fact there are ledges all the way round. This is high water, so we're quite protected. But Maine and the Chesapeake both tend to have calm mornings and afternoon sea breezes. Here we're heading west from Mount Desert Island. We have a following tide, you can see that on the buoy, over a narrow bar, heading towards Jericho Bay. In Jericho Bay, we have a grandstand view for the Eggemoggin Reach Regatta. This annual race is for wooden boats over 24 foot. The course starts at Brooklyn, known for the Wooden Boat School and a famous boat yard, and comes into Jericho Bay. The leaders have rounded the southern mark and are carrying skyscrapers back north. We have the grandstand view because we caught a lobster boy when being a bit slow about attack, and we are firmly anchored. We have a call out to Towboat US. He was on another job 50 miles away, and it would be at least 2 hours before he would get there. And luckily, before the 2 hours, or about the 2 hours, the tide changed, and we floated free. And so that was a happy ending. West of Jericho Bay is a narrow thoroughfare running south of Deer Isle, past Stonington, which is where lobstermen from miles around bring their catch to a busy pier for shipping. But they don't moor in this part of the harbour. People claim that this is the busiest fishing harbour in the US, but I'm not quite sure what metric they use. We like to anchor in a small bay not far from there. As you sail among the islands, there are innumerable islands. You will often see windjammers. This is looking west from Deer Isle towards the hills behind Camden. One lunchtime we anchored off Pond Island near Cape Rosier. This is a fairly typical site there because it has a nice beach and it's somewhere that people like to go for a picnic lunch. The Victory chimes is unmistakable with her 3 masts. We were on a mooring near her, north of the Eggemoggin Reach. Seals. In this part of Maine, there are many ledges favoured by harbour seals. Many of the white or grey patches on this ledge are seals. If they're disturbed, they will all lumber into the sea at once, often vocalizing loudly. But once in the water, some of the adults are happy to observe you from quite close. Okay. A few birds to finish with, if time, but there's no time. People can have a look at the bird slides at the end, if there's time. This is back to Bill for the last section.
I'm going to use 1 minute of my time to go through your birds, Caroline, because the birds are phenomenal.
Okay.
Shearwaters, garrets, terns, guillemots. I think guillemots are my favourite. These are puffins, razorbills. It's a fantastic place for birds, and a lot of the birds you only see if you're out on the water. I got very few slides about boat ownership, okay? Boats are full of equipment. I wanted, this slide, there are 3 things that have transformed sailing during our 50 or so years. First of all, with GPS, you know what you are, where you are. If you've ever blundered across the North Sea in fog, not knowing where you are, you realise what a wonderful thing it is to actually know where you are. Roller reefing of Genoa. In the old days, we used to change sails every time we had to, the wind went up or wind went down. We couldn't sail a big boat with outrun of Genoa, and autopilot. We couldn't sail comfortably two up without autopilot. Incidentally, everything in this diagram is something I installed myself, often 3rd generation. We navigate with paper charts. Caroline, point at your iPad. That's Caroline's iPad, which is an entirely independent backup system for navigation. And then we have the chart. Actually, Caroline sometimes thinks the iPad is the primary system.
It's far better. Bill, do you keep a paper chart updated while you're
When
sailing?
we're on passages, we mark a position on the chart every 2 hours. Sooner or later, chart plotters fail on you.
Right.
That's my feet. Everything wears out. Everything wears out. Cheap decks are lovely, but if you ask the price, you shouldn't ask the price. Access is terrible. At sea, you fix it. So you go without. When we're in the Bahamas, I blew up the engine. Richard, who I mentioned, rather than having the engine fixed there, Richard sailed the boat back to Annapolis with a few friends, and we had it fixed there. That's the sort of thing, that's typical Richard. Okay. They say that cruising is waiting for parts in exotic locations. Robert and Michelle had trouble waiting for parts on their engines. This exotic location is cheap because there's a Samos in Greece. He had to go to get parts flown in from Amsterdam. But Samos is a good place to get stranded. Accidents. This clam dredger is looking a bit sheepish because he just ran into us. And anyway, I don't want to end. Owning a boat is a commitment. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of time. It can often be a lot of fun, it's a lot of money. I don't want to end on that note. So here we are in Northeast Harbour in Maine. Quicksilver was our 25th wedding anniversary present. And if we'd known all the costs, we might never have bought her. I'm really glad we did. This was the best purchase we ever made. We've used her an incredible amount. She's good for another 50 years. And we are. So that's the end. Big rush to the end.
So we can certainly take some questions, but some people may be needing their dinner.
Right. Well, we're around the club from time to time, as everybody knows.